Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly Chai Chat Club. My name is Gulshan, and I'm from American Center, Tashkent. And today I'm very excited to welcome our guest speaker, Pollys Cegielski. Hello, Polly.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
I appreciate the offer. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So Pollys Cegielski is a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She has taught as a educator at college, focusing her courses and research on gender and security. And she will talk today about influential women from around the world. And as usual, all our viewers, you will have a chance to ask your question in real time and get answers. So please don't hesitate to put your questions and comments in the comments box right below this video, and Polly will answer them after the presentation. We want to make it as interactive as possible. And Polly, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. As Gulshan said, I'm going to talk about women in power. I would also bring in ideas about gender, women leaders, and not just leaders, but influencers as well, and what we think about when we say women in power and the word power and what that means. And also the challenges that women face in being leaders and how ideas that we have about gender to engage with me using the chat as a dialogue. I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, but if you can put your responses into the chat, and then Gulshan will be able to filter them back so we can have a little bit more interactivity, because I would love to hear your answers to some questions so we can talk about this topic a little bit more. How many people do we have signed up, or how many people are watching?
Right now we have 4 people watching us, but people will join us.
All right. Well, I'm going to drive forward with the PowerPoint. And again, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And then there'll be sections where I'm going to ask you to type things in the chat to specific prompts. So my first question is, and this was actually a question that Gulshan had asked what people were interested in as a topic when we had Women's History Month, and people were interested in women in power, women leaders, or influential women through time. And so I want to ask you, why do we care about women being in roles of power or being able to make decisions? And I'm curious as to why you think we should study this, or this should be a topic that we talk about. And if you could put some of your ideas in the chat, I would appreciate it. Do we have anything in the chat, Gulshan?
So we have greetings from Samarkand, and that's and from Tojiv Ochelbek, and with some people saying hi to us. Okay. We can continue probably.
I was asking them to put responses in the chat as to why this is a topic that they're interested in, or why it's a topic that people should talk about. Did anyone respond?
So we have Mina Gevel. She's saying, because women in power are more common than standard history teaching would have us believe.
Well, thank you, Mina. This is true. It's often something that we because we don't see it often, we don't think it happens, but women have been in leadership roles throughout recorded history and even before recorded history. This is true. Anyone else have any comments?
Yes, one more comment from Omona Chilov. Women rights are human rights.
Are what of human rights? I'm sorry.
Women rights are human rights.
Women rights are human rights. Absolutely. And how to leadership, the difference in gender, women skew a little bit higher. So there tend to be more women in a country. And if their voices aren't being heard, then we're not getting full representation. And women have great ideas. And women also advocate for women and will help ensure that laws address women equally and so that they can have equal access to human rights as well. And I wanted to bring forth some research that shows the importance of women being in leadership roles. This one that was done in 1990 and 2004 found that women leaders tend to be more democratic, and they look to ensure that everyone who's seated at the table gets a chance to speak and participate in making decisions. They also like to build consensus more so that everyone has a vote instead of being dictated to. Also, male leaders tend to be more autocratic, meaning that they want to dictate what their opinions are, whereas women have what they tend to have more leading from behind type of approach, where, again, they want to have more collaboration, more people having dialogue and conversations. And then also women want to ensure that there's positive relationships. And also they're more likely to use positive incentives rather than negative consequences when trying to ensure actions or behaviors. And then also a little bit more, when we take a look specifically at the recent pandemic in COVID-19, those countries that had women as leaders were shown to have better outcomes because women potentially were more proactive and they had more coordinated policy responses. So we have women leaders who are working together across the globe, and their countries fared better in the pandemic than those that were led by men. And then also looking in more generally, when you have diversity in boards, so not only just having women, but people of different races, people of different backgrounds, religions, ethnicity, you're going to have a greater pool of ideas because you're going to be able to pull from different areas. And when you have this on your boards or in groups of leaders, it makes for better problem solving. And you also see that those businesses that have greater diversity, they also make more money. So it affects your bottom line. So it's in a business's best interest to have more women on their boards and in leadership. And then lastly, women also make better mentors than men because they tend to, and this is not every woman, they tend to be more collaborative and they're interested in ensuring that the people that they mentor are achieving the career that they want. And this helps with job satisfaction. So we have all these different ideas about why women leaders are important. And so this will drive us forward in this conversation because we know that it's important. It's something that we should support within our own communities as well. Now, I wanted to tell you, give you a quick outline of what it is we're going to be covering. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, and then we're going to ask some questions about women and men and the ideas that we have about what men's characteristics are and what women's characteristics are, and how this unfortunately creates bias, subconscious bias, a bias that we have in our minds that we don't even think about, that we automatically assign to men and women, and then how this affects women becoming leaders. And then I have some data for you from a recent report that was put out by the UN on women in politics. And then we're going to conclude with a little bit of a conversation about power and how you can lead in your own community. So to start off, there's a little bit about me. So when I was a young girl, I always was asking questions, and I drove my parents crazy. But a lot of these questions included questions about gender, specifically, when you're a kid and you're told to do something, and I'm like, well, why do I have to do that and my brother doesn't? So we had very different ideas in my household about who does what kind of job. So I was supposed to do the dishes and I cleaned the house and my brothers didn't. I had to wear a dress going to church. Obviously, in American culture, women don't tend to wear dresses, but I thought about these things and I looked at them. I wanted to have answers to these questions, but my parents didn't really have answers that satisfied me. My brothers were praised for playing sports, but I was encouraged to draw. So we had some definite differences as to what my behavior as a girl was supposed to be and what their behavior was a boy. And so I knew there were differences because I had friends who lived in houses. I would go visit them, and their households were not structured that way. So that got me thinking a lot, and it affected what I studied in school. So I started out in Arizona at the University of Arizona, where I studied anthropology because I was curious about people and their behaviors and their culture. And I focused on Middle Eastern studies, but I looked a lot at women in the Middle East as well. And from there, I moved on to the University of Colorado, where I focused on nonprofit management. And I also volunteered at several different organizations that look specifically at women and girls and trying to get girls into more technical fields, such as science, technology, engineering, and math. We had weekend workshops where we would teach girls how to use different types of computer programming or build robots, things along those lines. It was wonderful. And trying to encourage girls, especially in that preteen age from like 12 to 14, when they tend to drop out of technology, that technology is something that women can do. And then lastly, I also was working on I did a master's in global governance and human security, which is what I'm also researching right now for my PhD. I'm looking at gender within NATO and the military and how gender differences there can affect men and women. So I've kind of been all my life questioning these kinds of behaviors about gender and how they differ across cultures, and they do affect how women are perceived, and also specifically women leaders. And I wanted to ask, who decides who gets to be a leader? I wanted to know, is it true everywhere? Are there exceptions? And I also learned about the biases that we carry in our head that we learn from our culture, from our parents, our friends, and our media about how men and women are supposed to behave. And all of this will show itself up as we go through this presentation. So what I'd like to start out with, and I do this a lot with my classes that I taught on gender, if you could put in the chat some characteristics that you attribute to men and then characteristics that you attribute to women. And I don't want you to think about it too much. Just think about if you had to describe men and you had to describe women, what would you say about them?
We have Gairat already answered your question even before you asked that. He says that women can make bold and wise decisions, and as leaders, this helps make the team environment less authoritative and more cooperative, bringing a family-like feel to the team.
Okay. But I'm thinking about like specific characteristics about men and women, not necessarily anything related to leadership or working in a group. Just
Nothing yet.
it's okay.
Okay, we have a comment from Amon. He says, men brutal, direct, loud, not talkative, into themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good one. All of those I have heard before. Do we have someone who can respond to how they think women, characteristics of women?
Characteristics from Amon again. Women, talkative, emotional, creative, Manipulative.
Manipulative. All right. Yeah. So I've done this many times with different classes, and here are some of the ones that my students had said, which is very close to what Aman said. Women tend to have what they call are attributed to have communal characteristics, that they're caring, they're emotional. He said manipulative. They tend to have what we might call soft power. I've heard them described as being gossips, soft and gentle, whereas men, we have like brutal, logical, direct, hard, physical, all of these types of what they would call agentic, that they have agency, which is the ability to take action or to choose a direction, whereas women are considered more subordinate. They're not necessarily taking action, but they're supportive. So I want to ask you, when you look at these two, we can see the inherent differences, but do you think it's true all the time? I mean, I think we can all say we know women who are strong, we know women who are direct, and we also know men who are talkative and men who can be gentle. Why do you think we have these differences hardwired in us about what men are and what women are, even though we know people who don't necessarily follow these roles? And my other question would be, is why don't we see any of the same words on both lists? Is there a characteristic that can describe both men and women?
Polly, Shahista describes men as emotional, and in your list you have women emotional.
Yeah, so I think we can take any one of these words and the great suggestions put out by Aman, and we can put them on either list. But we tend to put, we characterize men and women in an either or. So we put them at the ends of a line. So if men are one thing, then women are the opposite. If women are one thing, then men are the opposite. So we tend to put what we call a binary, that they can't share these characteristics. But we know, like, we have people in our lives that are women who are strong and logical and can be direct. And we also know men who can be emotional and caring. But we carry these ideas in our head subconsciously about how men and women are supposed to be. Now we're going to shift this a little bit. I want you to think about, what are 5 characteristics of a successful manager or a leader? Or you can just write some, what first comes to your mind when you think of what a successful manager or leader is.
Okay, some thoughts from Aman. Inclusive, enthusiastic, energetic, team player, empathetic.
Okay, great responses, Aman. Thank you. I appreciate your participation. Anybody else?
Dildora says punctual, smart, hardworking, extrovert, motivated. Shahista says strict, punctual, respectful, smart, a bit kind.
Okay.
Huria says good time managers, honest, smart worker, kind but not stupid, never give up.
few of these down so I can refer back to them. All right, so we've got a lot of these different characteristics that you guys have talked about, and I would type them in on here, but if I do that, then it'll stop the PowerPoint. So I'm not going to do that because we don't want to challenge the technology here. So there was a researcher did a test on this in the United States, where they had same thing, asked people to write down what they considered to be the characteristics of a successful manager. And what they found is those characteristics tended to align with what people put in as characteristics for men. Now, granted, this was back in 1973, but even coming in more recently in 2020, there was another researcher who found we still tend to have these same ideas. Now, the ones that you listed, most of them, a lot of them were more of the communal. There was empathetic, there was kind, there was a team player. So you're noting those characteristics that we would put in the communal category where people are working together. But there were some direct, punctual, maybe never give up, that are on the little harder side that maybe we might attribute more to men. And so what this researcher found is that the traits for leaders generally tend to be those that are considered masculine. So even before we start thinking about women leaders, we've already put leaders as having characteristics that we tend to associate with men, which makes it difficult for women to become leaders and also think of themselves as leaders. They may think, well, this is what a leader is, and that's not something I do, that's something someone else does, or that's something that a man does. So that's one of the reasons we tend to see not as many women becoming leaders. And it also makes people think that women aren't as legitimate as leaders as well. So I'd also ask you, so let's say we have a woman that shows what we would consider stereotypically, things that we attribute to men. Maybe they're strong, maybe they're direct, maybe they're punctual, things along these lines. Because we've seen this in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries as well. What happens when we have women, and Hillary Clinton was a great example of this, that they come across as having these masculine characteristics? How are these women described?
So we have some comments called strict, unnegotiable, slab of beef, psychotic.
What was that last thing?
Slab of beef, psychotic, murderous, corrupt, evil. Yes, that's what we have.
Okay. Slab of beef means, but okay. So yeah, when women show those characteristics that we would necessarily associate with men, in the United States, they're called nasty, or they're called bitches. And so this is what we call an agency paradox. So while we want leaders to have these particular characteristics, and women show those characteristics, but then we don't like women who show those characteristics. So again, this is another thing that contributes to women not being able to move into that public role, into a leadership role. There was another study that showed women get backlash for this, and this happened to Hillary, the amount of very negative press and also very negative comments that happened when she was on the campaign trail, and the horrific things that she was called during her run for president, and what she was called by the eventual President Trump, and even wanting her to be locked up. I mean, you don't see this happening to men. And what they also found out in this study is that if women are able to, when they're campaigning or during their role as leaders, show that they have these characteristics, but also what we consider the more feminine characteristics. They show warmth, that they show community, then they are rated higher. Then they are more approved of. Whereas men only have to show that they have those strong characteristics. They never have to show that they're family oriented or they're communal. That's not considered as necessary for them to be in a leadership role. So this again contributes to why we don't see as many women leaders, especially in the global arena. Okay. So we know that women and men are equal intellectually. There's no biological difference to what men and women can do as far as science and technology or capabilities or scholastically. So why do you think, we talked about a couple of these things, but why do you think there aren't more leaders, more women influencers?
Dildora says that they mostly criticized by community.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. The community again has these biases against women that they either can't embody the characteristics that we think of as a leader, or maybe there's some cultural rules that don't like having women in public spaces. This can definitely impact how women can become leaders, or if they can become women leaders.
Mm-hmm. One more comment from white CIS male, because they lack the appropriate skills.
And and a lot of that can be due to biases in education. Maybe girls weren't allowed to go to school. Maybe they weren't allowed to have those experiences that we would want to have in a leader. Someone that has had management experience. If you're not allowed to be a manager, then how can you get management experience? If you're not allowed to be a leader, then how can you if you're not allowed to lead in smaller places, maybe at the district level or maybe on a city council, it becomes much harder for you to then move up the ladder and say maybe represent a region or to represent your country or a state, things along those lines. Yes, those are two great answers as to why we don't see women leaders. Are there any other suggestions?
Yes, Odin says old stereotypes having deep cultural roots.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a big part of it. Certain cultures really prefer women to stay with what we call the private sphere, or the home aspect, and not to be in public life. And again, that may not, that doesn't say that they're not capable, but it's just within the culture that they prefer that women aren't in the public role, even if they have the skill set and they have the abilities and could be a great benefit to the community. Any others before I move on?
Yes, Dildora says because they are more busy with their family, children, and restrictions by husbands.
This actually plays a big role, and it's not just in what we would call non-Western countries, but this does happen in Western countries as well. There was a study probably about 4 years ago as to why we don't have more women in the United States going into Senate or Congress. And that's definitely a part of it, is that women said they are so busy as it is because a lot of them work, and then they have to turn around and then go home. They're doing double duty. So have a full-time job and then take care of the children, take care of the household, and finding the time to also run for office or to be a local representative would be just exhausting because women don't have parity in the home, which means men and women aren't doing the same role at home. So they're not sharing the workload. They don't both equally go take kids to doctor's appointments, or they don't equally take care of elderly parents who live in the home. And that's a huge part of it. If you're exhausted by just what you're doing already, adding yet another thing to do to your list just doesn't sound like something you would want to do. There's also some other studies that show when you become a public leader, that really puts you on display and allows for people to attack you. It allows for, your privacy becomes invaded. Like in the United States, you have to, you should show what your tax records are. There's a lot of your life that becomes very, very public. And a lot of women don't want to do that. That's another reason why they opt out as well. But back to the stereotypes that Odine said, we have these ideas, again, about what men and women are supposed to do. We learn these from, like in my household, like I said, when I was a little girl, we had specific roles for what the male children did and what the female children did. But we also learn these from our culture, from our personal experiences, and also from the media, what we see in images that are shown to us. Think about the millions of images that children see on telephones, or on their cell phones, or on television, and how that can shape your perceptions. So we're being inundated by pictures of how men and women are supposed to behave as well. And a lot of these are what are known as biases. So ideas that we have sometimes without having evidence for, but that we just assume are correct. And there's different types of biases. There's some, they're called unconscious, meaning that we don't think about it, we just respond to it, or inherent biases. And we developed these, as we were growing as cultures. And in some ways, it was very helpful to have a bias. So if you were, out gathering food in the forest and you knew a certain area was where the saber-toothed tigers were, you developed this automatic shortcut in your head so you didn't have to think about it every time you came across this particular part of the forest and said, oh yeah, that's where the saber-toothed tigers are. You knew inherently to avoid it. But unfortunately, when we have these automatic processes, it also can lead to prejudice about certain people or certain individuals or certain situations. So for those of you that are on laptops or maybe on your phones, so this is very pervasive, and I'm always amazed when I do this because it seems to work every single time. Do a Google search on a particular type of profession. I did mine on librarians, and do it as an image search and see whether men or women are represented more. And that can show the bias of a particular society as to who is supposed to fill that role. And I'm curious to see what you get. So I had put in the profession librarian and did an image search on Google, and it was pretty much 80% women in the pictures that were shown. So what profession did you pick, and what did you see as far as the images?
Amon said I put lawyer, so much less women picks.
Which is interesting because I think in some countries there's more women that are graduating as lawyers, but we still think of men as lawyers. And I think in the United States we have more women graduating as doctors, but we still think of doctors as being men and nurses being women. And that's another thing, another way to look at it too, is like if you did a search on nurses, there's a bias there that it tends to be only women because men are doctors. So anyone else have any results from that?
Not yet. I put primary school teacher, and it's all women.
Women, yeah. Generally, anything like below 5th or 6th grade is considered that's what women do. Women teach the younger ages, and then when you get into the higher grades, you'll see more men. And then, of course, professors, tend to be men as well, and especially professors who are in the harder sciences. So we can see that as a cultural bias, but it's almost global as well. I mean, granted, your search is also tailored to you. That's the great thing about Google. And if you haven't watched Social Dilemma, the movie on Netflix, please, everybody watch it. It will change how you think about social media. But as a culture, we have these biases. We have these ideas about how men and women, and not only gender, but we can take this to race and to education and to language. I have a link here at the bottom of the slide, and it is a test your implicit bias. It's put out by, I forget which university. It's LMU. Somebody help me out here. And encourage you to try it, and you can see what your implicit biases are. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So the other one is affinity bias, and this one is really interesting as well. And I found this, and I thought, oh, this is a great one to do. So, if you've got a piece of paper, maybe just on your phone, I want you to write down the initials of 6 people that you trust that are not in your family. And again, don't think too much about it. Just think about the people that you interact with the most, the people at work that you trust the most, maybe your best friends. Just write down their initials.
How many initials do we need to write?
Whatever helps you remember who they are. It doesn't matter. Or you could write their first names. Yeah, initials just make it shorter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then what I'm going to have you do is take a look at this list and put a check mark next to all of them who are the same gender as you are. Let's start with gender. Then put a check mark next to ones that are the same race as you are. Then ones who have the same native language as you. And then those who have the same religion as you. And then those who have the same nationality as you. Put a check mark next to those. So are you seeing a trend here? When you put the check marks next to your list of trusted people, and we could go on with this. We could look at age. We could look at socioeconomic status. Do they make the same amount of money as you? Did they grow up in the same area as you? Do they live in the same country? I mean, all sorts of characteristics. But what tends to happen is that the people that we trust tend to be just like us. And this, again, can be an issue when not only looking at women leaders, but leaders who are different from us, because we don't tend to trust people as much who are not like us. And this will often result in that a lack of diversity. And we talked about before, having greater diversity means greater ideas. So maybe that's something, I think about as well, is like, maybe I need to branch out, that my circle of trust, I need to get other people that I trust that can bring different ideas to me and help me think about things in different ways. But this also relates, obviously, to women leaders, because if we're seeing women, even as women, we tend not to trust women leaders, one, because they don't have those characteristics, but maybe they are from a different race, or maybe they speak another language. So that's something to be aware of when you have these gut reactions, that bias that we believe certain things just because it feels right, and then questioning, well, why does that feel right? And it could be sometimes that we're carrying these biases in our head. But I also want to ask you, does inherent bias impact men? We talk a lot about gender, and gender tends to be, we focus a lot on women and women's rights, human rights. Women's rights are human rights, absolutely. But gender is both men and women and everything in between. So when we have inherent bias, like thinking men are doctors and women are nurses, what impact does that have for men?
Someone is asking, can you clarify the impact part, please?
So, we know that cultural biases, things that we learn from our culture about women, limit women's ability to become leaders. But what about those biases that we have about men? What kind of impact does that have for them? Does that help? Or you want more?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Mukaddam says, we're used to accept our men as leader in a family, but not outside of the family.
Interesting. Aren't most of your leaders outside of the family men?
Yes.
So I guess I don't understand his statement then. Maybe he meant men are leaders in the family, but women aren't leaders in the family?
Maybe. We'll see what Mukaddam will reply.
Okay.
Amon says, men are breadwinners. I think sometimes it leaves them without any choice to pursue their passions in life, but rather do something that just brings money.
Yeah, that's an important one. This idea that men are the breadwinners. And I was just thinking about this. What would happen in Uzbek society if a man decided, you know what, I don't necessarily want to have a family, or I don't want to have children? What would his family and friends think of him? Like, he would probably get a lot of criticism for that. We even see that some in the United States, but less so. People who decide maybe getting married is not for them, maybe having children is not for them, but we're still very much judged by society. I don't have any children and I am not married. And, I get questioned by people all the time, when am I going to get married? When am I going to have kids? So we have these stereotypes, but it definitely impacts men. And the example I like to use is nurses, because there's such a stigma for men who become nurses in the United States. It's a very small percentage, even though it's a great profession. Being a nurse, you can make great money. I mean, the breadwinner part gets filled there, but we have this idea that nurse equals women. So men who become nurses tend to get a lot of criticism. Also, men who display some of those more, quote, feminine characteristics, maybe they're caring or they're kind, They also are less likely to be promoted. They're less likely to be seen as effective employees by their supervisors and their peers. If men are empathetic, they tend to be not valued as much. So gender bias also impacts men, especially when we look within gender. So this isn't just about women. This has negative consequences for men as well. So good responses, everybody. But I wanted to say that there have been some changes. Now, I apologize, I don't have any kind of data for Uzbekistan. So I was going to show one from the United States. And if you see all the way over on the left at 1953, in the red, we have 66% prefer having a male boss. But if we come all the way to 2017, this has dropped to 23%. And the women preferring a female boss is now up to 21%. So we're almost equal. And then 55 say they don't care. So it's definitely, you see a difference by age. The younger a person is, the less likely they are to care. But this is a positive sign. And having this shift in job preferences shows that there's also a greater appreciation for those different traits that you guys talked about, that you listed in the chat, that are definitely those more communal things that you wanted someone who was a team player as opposed to someone who was directing and telling you what to do. So that is also a positive sign as well. So next, I wanted to show you, we have what they call portfolios, meaning the areas where we can find women ministers across the globe. And this is getting into this amazing report that's put up by UN Women. It came out this year, and it's looking at women in politics across the globe. And if you look at the areas where you're most likely to find women ministers, or in the ministries that women are located in, it tends to still be these kind of soft, what they call soft categories, like social affairs, employment, labor, human resources, education, culture. That's where we find a majority of the women. But when you get down to what they call the harder areas, or your more direct diplomacy, things like finance and budget, parliamentary affairs, defense, things along those lines, you see less and less women. And then the next one I wanted to show you, I was able to pull some data from Uzbekistan, and then I couldn't fit all 193 countries on here. And if I did, you would not be able to read it at all. So I just picked out a few. So you can see here in the light blue, we have women in ministerial positions, what percentage in these 6 different countries. And I did have the US, but I apologize, the chart got cut off. And then we also have women in parliament, and then in the lower house, and then upper house. And some of them only have 2 because they don't make a distinction. They don't have an upper and lower house. But what I found very interesting in Nicaragua, there's more women in ministerial positions than men, and Nicaragua was the highest. But there are also 12 countries that have no women in their ministries, and a couple of those were Armenia, Azerbaijan, Papua New Guinea, Yemen, Vanuatu, the People's Republic of Korea, and then Vietnam. But you can see here, Uzbekistan has a very low number. Only 3% of their ministerial positions have women holding those roles. But the number goes up, at least for women in parliament in the lower house, and then drops slightly with women in the upper house. And then you can compare Uzbekistan's number to Tajikistan and also Afghanistan. Afghanistan has quotas. So they are required to have, I believe it's 20% women in their upper and lower houses, or around that amount. I don't know if there's quotas in Uzbekistan or not. Can't answer that question. So this is kind of what we see right now, a snapshot in time for women in politics. Now, currently, there are only 5%, almost 6% women who are heads of state. So there were 9, and then 13 women who are heads of government. Again, I couldn't put every picture on here. I picked out the ones I thought you might find the most interesting, and I tried to show some racial diversity as well. You can see that these different countries have been able to elect women to the highest positions that they have in their particular countries. I'm sure we've all heard of Angela Merkel in Germany, and then Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, but I was not aware that Gabon or Estonia also had a woman as their head of government as well. But you still look at the percentages, it's still incredibly low. So we're seeing that those biases and those stereotypes definitely are impacting, because women have the abilities, they have the skill set, but they don't necessarily have the chance to move up in government or to move up as international leaders and roles. So I want to go into that idea of power. And what is when we talk about women in power or men in power, what does power mean to you? What does it mean when someone has power?
Mukaddam says that power means respect, influence, care.
I like how she worded that. Anyone else?
Yes, power means ability to affect change.
Affect change, that's another good way to put it.
Having power, the ability to decide and impact on people's life.
All good answers. So,
power, and one more from Akin, sorry.
It's okay.
Power is having resources and authority to make decisions to help the nation.
So in looking at these four responses, it's very interesting. We have one, respect, influence, care. Care is that communal part. Power as the ability to affect change. That can be applied not just to people, but things as well. And, you put water in your teapot, you're changing the water. So that could be, you're affecting change on that water, but that also works with people and influence in government. And then also the ability to decide, that agency, that you get to decide what happens. And then authority as well. That's an important one. So traditionally, power is thought of as the ability, having power over something, having power over people, meaning you're able to control their actions, to control their abilities. But there's been a shift lately, as you guys have mentioned, with the characteristics you put in leaders, that maybe power is also communal. It's not necessarily the power over, but the power with. Maybe it's shared power. Maybe it is able to make decisions together. Maybe because of that authority that you're given by the people is a shared authority. So I think shifting how we think about power will also change how we think about leaders. So if we don't think it as someone who is directive, and deciding decisions on their own, but we think of it more in that communal sense, we might be more accepting of having women in leadership roles as well. So I also wanted to ask you, how have women traditionally exercised power? Maybe not at the forefront. We talked about some cultures, they don't like having women in that public sphere, but that didn't mean that women didn't have power in those communities, in those societies. How else do women have power? How have they traditionally had power? Or what are other ways that women can have power?
We have the answer: women exercise power in family. Mm-hmm. And the other answer is by being a respected, calming influence. And another one is skill to lead, motivate, and of course, influence.
So even while we may not have lots of women, in seats of parliament or Congress or in ministries, women definitely still have influence, though it may not be incredibly obvious. And I wanted to show you a short list of Forbes put out its 100 most powerful women. Forbes is an economic magazine. I believe it's put out in the US, but it's published in the US, but it's global. And I wanted to pick out women who weren't in a ministry, weren't in government, because people can be influential and not necessarily be in politics, which is that's always an opportunity for everybody. Each one of you can become influencers within your own communities, but also globally, and not necessarily be part of the government. And the one I really wanted to point out was Melinda Gates. Obviously, a lot of her power and influence comes from having immense amounts of money. And money will always get you power and influence. But she's been able to take that, and with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she is affecting change in ways that could never have been imagined. I think, she's probably in the top 5 most influential women in the world, because she's affecting change in Africa. She's helping girls there. She's affecting change in Southeast Asia, whether it's through providing resources, providing education. So there's options outside of the government that if you're not comfortable, or women aren't comfortable, having that lack of privacy that tends to come with these very public positions, there's other things that are available. We have General Motors CEO is a woman. I'd like to point out TikTok, which is one of the best or most used apps in the world, is also the CEO is a woman. And even in places like Saudi Arabia, which tends to be very limiting of women's roles, we can see one of the largest financial groups in that country is also run by a woman. So there's options outside of that, of being just in government. But the last thing I wanted to point out as far as influence is just being a mother. We tend to discount what women as mothers can do as far as influencers. But if you think about it, they provide the care for a growing individual almost completely from ages 1 to 5, and shape how they think and shape how a child approaches the world, and probably also contribute a lot to those inherent biases that we have. So being a mother can also be a way to have a positive influence on the world, and how you help grow your children to be better citizens, and maybe to see women as equals and equal participants and having equal human rights, and be capable and effective leaders. And across the globe, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of groups that are specifically mothers who come together over a particular issue. And they've been able to have huge impacts within their not only local communities, but at the regional and national level as well. The one I think about the most is the demining campaign, was started by mothers who were concerned about their children getting killed by leftover mines from different wars. So women who come together have power. People who come together have power and a voice. And so that's always a way to leverage influence as well. So lastly, I wanted to conclude with some ideas I have. These obviously aren't the only ones, of how you, not just women, but men and women, can become leaders within your own community, but also support women who are trying to become leaders. One is volunteering. That's one of the best things you can do. There's needs out there. Every community has needs, and asking yourself, how can I serve? How can I better help my community, which is going to give you lots of experience as to what people's needs and issues are. And that could, in turn, if you wanted to go into something a little more public, whether you wanted to go on local council or become part of the government, it gives you great experience and can make you seem more legitimate as a leader as well. And also being a mentor. If you have a particular skill set, if you have worked in a certain industry, how can you help someone else, particularly young women who are trying to succeed in that role or succeed in that industry, and for being a support for them. And then if you see women businesses, utilizing women businesses, helping out with women or girl-oriented education programs. There's one called Technovation that happens here in Uzbekistan, where they partner young girls with older women, or younger women and older women, to explore technology, and they have a competition. Certain organizations like that, and there's a lot of different programs where you could provide support for things along those lines. So there's lots of things that you could do to help women become more accepted as leaders and maybe move yourself into a leadership role. And I appreciate your time and hearing about Wonder Women and the positive impacts women can have as leaders and things that we can do to help support women to become leaders. And I know we don't have huge amounts of time, but I'm willing to stay as long as you want, and we can have a conversation, or if you want to ask specific questions.
Thank you so much, Polly. That was a great conversation, and a lot of involvement from our viewers, both on YouTube and Facebook. We do have a couple of questions, interesting questions that I thought you might want to answer. Just a second, I'm going to find them. So Oydin Sabirova is asking, what do you think about running programs which provide more access to higher education to girls from villages?
I think that's a great idea. I think and I don't know if she is specifically referring to Uzbekistan, but anytime you're able to increase the numbers of girls that are participating in school and make it equal with that of the participation of boys, you're going to have a more educated society. Because again, not only are the girls are learning, and they can become more productive citizens, but they in turn will become mothers. And multiple studies have shown that the more educated the mother is, the more educated the child will be, and also the healthier the child will be. They're more likely to live into adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm just going through, we have so many comments. I'm just going through the comments to see the questions.
You know what? Would it help if I got out of the PowerPoint and then I can see stuff too?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So there is one more interesting question. How does greater diversity yield greater ideas? Wouldn't smarter people yield greater ideas regardless of diversity?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define smart. So if you mean by smart meaning more educated, you would hope the more education they have, the more exposure they would have to more ideas. But this isn't always true. We have people who may go to school and it's a very small school, so they aren't necessarily exposed to more ideas. I find that, this is what happens in academia a lot. You get a lot of educators together, but if they're all from like the same group, let's say they're all political scientists or they're all engineers, they kind of tend to think alike. And so if you got an engineer and then someone, let's say one of the people who sweeps the street, and let's add a taxi driver, and let's add someone who works in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Imagine the diversity of ideas that you would have there. It isn't always necessarily about education, because what the experiences those people have who work on the front lines as opposed to the people that sit up in the offices are going to be very different. And so I think that type of greater, you're going to get ideas that people in the office would have never thought of.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I don't see any questions right now. But
one that says, why would you suggest it's a good thing to support women who want to become leaders? Why be sexist? I would push back and say, I don't think that's being sexist. I think that's trying to create parity. it's not to say men aren't good leaders as well, but as we've talked about, there's many instances where women aren't given the same opportunities as men to become leaders. So sexism is, that's the bias of having power over, and we're trying to remove that power differential so men and women have equal power in making decisions. So I wanted to, taxi driver is not going to assist a biologist, and I don't think that's the type of diversity you were referring to. You don't know that. You have no idea what the taxi driver is experiencing or what the biologist is experiencing. And granted, it's going to depend on what it is you're trying to bring them together to talk about. If it's a community issue, say something about a river, well, maybe the taxi driver drives along the river every day, and so he's going to see how people use it, whereas the biologist may be taking samples and back to the lab and analyzing the chemicals in them. So they're going to provide a different perspective. And then the mother who walks her kids along the river may be seeing more of the trash and concerns about the homeless that are living there that the other two wouldn't see. So everyone would provide a great input. Now, diversity, yes, it can also mean race, it can mean gender, it can mean age, it can mean socioeconomic status, it can mean sexual preference. All of those things will contribute as well. Why would I want to create parity? Because everybody should have the opportunity to provide input into the decisions that affect them. Place Fauci with a taxi driver? Well, we know that's not realistic. And you're just being adversarial. And I appreciate the comments, but let's have a conversation that's actually going to contribute to making the world a better place.
Thank you.
All right. I appreciate everyone's time, and I hope you come back. I might be trying to do some more, but not necessarily on this topic. But great kudos and appreciation for Gulshan and to setting this up and the hard work that her team does and doing these chats every Friday. And if you have ideas about what you'd like to see for future chats, please let her know. I don't know if you have a link or an email that you can share in the chat with everybody. I would love to see what your ideas are as well.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Polly. It was very interesting, great conversation. And I want to thank everyone for wonderful comments and participation. And see you next Friday. Have a good weekend.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.